This presentation provides a brief overview of key findings from our study of how racial threat and interracial contact contributed to predicting white support for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. Now, many people have assumed that Trump won the election in large part because of racial threat, or this feeling that many white people have that other racial groups might threaten their own economic well-being or their way of life. And in fact, some studies have shown that the more whites felt a sense of racial threat, the more likely they were to support Trump in the 2016 election. And at the same time, there's a lot of social science research to suggest that greater racial diversity or greater numbers of people from other racial and ethnic groups where you live can provoke greater feelings of racial threat, at least among white Americans. That is, the more people from other racial and ethnic groups that live in areas where white people live, the more likely it is that white people will feel a sense of racial threat. So if we put these pieces together, what the research would suggest is that greater numbers of people from other racial backgrounds where whites live should lead white people to feel racial threat. And the more they feel threatened, the more likely they'd be to support Trump in the 2016 presidential election. But in our research, we wanted to ask whether this would necessarily be the case. That is it true that greater racial diversity would only predict greater racial threat or greater support for Trump among whites? And what other features of the social and economic context where whites live might drive these feelings of racial threat and support for Trump? And so we conducted a nationwide survey of about 1,700 non-Hispanic white Americans in February 2016, when presidential candidates were campaigning for their party's nomination. What our research shows is that greater racial diversity does not only provoke racial threat. Greater racial diversity also provides opportunities for contact between racial groups. That is, opportunities for white people to interact with and get to know people from other racial groups. And the more contact whites have with people from other racial groups, the less likely they are to feel a sense of racial threat. What we also find is that both pathways importantly shaped white support for Trump in the 2016 election. That in part, whites who lived in areas with greater numbers of people from other racial groups were generally more likely to feel a sense of racial threat, and the more threatened they felt, the more likely they were to support Trump. And at the same time, whites who lived in areas with greater numbers of people from other racial groups were also more likely to interact with people from those other racial groups. And the more they interacted with them, the less threatened they felt, and the less likely they were to support Trump. We also found that the strength of these pathways depended on the local economic conditions where white people lived. For example, we found that racial diversity was less strongly linked to racial threat in areas where there were lower rates of white unemployment, or where the economic conditions for whites were pretty good. Instead, racial diversity was more strongly linked to greater racial threat in areas where there were higher rates of white unemployment, or where the economic conditions were more challenging for whites. So this suggests that racial diversity may not always provoke feelings of racial threat in whites, and that whites are more likely to feel a sense of racial threat when they're facing difficult economic circumstances. So you might be wondering, why are these findings important? Well, because if we only think about racial diversity as a factor that leads whites to feel a sense of racial threat, then we might become inclined to think about racial diversity as a problem. Instead, our findings encourage us to recognize that racial diversity in and of itself is not inherently a problem. Importantly, racial diversity also provides crucial opportunities for interracial contact that can help to lessen or alleviate feelings of racial threat. Our findings also suggest that economic conditions carry a lot of weight in determining whether racial diversity or the presence of other racial groups will provoke a sense of threat among whites. And that if we really wish to alleviate whites' feelings of racial threat, or the effects that racial threat could potentially have on white support for political candidates, it probably makes more sense for us to focus on improving their economic conditions and prospects rather than seeking to minimize diversity or segregate whites from other racial groups in our society.